Okay, we'll get started, and thank you for those of you who join us on time and other people will be joining us later on. We will be recording this, so it will be available on our website after the presentation. So we'll get started. Once again, my name is Fred LeFranc. I'm the founder of Results Through Strategy, and we have Eddy, who does a lot of our operational consulting, and Mike Lukianoff, who works with us in analytics as well, who is with Fishbowl. So our focus today, and we're excited about this because this is actually a big part of what we do, is to talk about how you can actually increase sales through throughput. In our work, because day-to-day operations is so captivating and distractive, we have found that many operators have failed to see the opportunity to grow sales within the business that they have right now. And so the benefits of throughput and increased throughput, number one is operational enhancement. The overall guest experience improves, and you actually have, higher quality food, better guest satisfaction. And depending on the kind of concept you are, if you're a fast casual or a QSR, which is a limited service restaurant versus a sit-down service restaurant, there's either a reduced queue for people that have lines or reduced waiting times at front doors, and your table turns will increase as well in sit-down restaurants. The biggest benefit, quite frankly, is that you increase sales and reduce labor while increasing guest satisfaction. Those three things happen simultaneously as a big outcome of improving your throughput. And throughput, as you're going to see, we're going to get into this, there's a lot of science to it, and I know we're all focused on having a great guest experience, but what we're going to spend our time talking about today is really much more of the science, the math, and the engineering, and just be assured that you end up having a better guest experience overall. So we want to start off by giving you a chance to understand some of the terms you're going to use today. So I will leave this up for a little bit so you can read through it. I will go through it myself, but you can make notes, and again, we will have this available to you after the webinar should you need to have a copy of it, or you can take a screenshot of it right now. So first off, throughput is the process speed by which someone goes through the system. We measure throughput in a couple different ways. There's the actual throughput from the time a guest walks into your restaurant to the time they leave, the entire guest turn, or just we'll focus on the actual time through the kitchen once an order is received in the kitchen as well as it gets out. That's just sort of a sub-component of the overall guest experience. Again, be it a limited service restaurant or a full service restaurant. TURF, which is an analysis research study that we do, stands for Total Unduplicated Reach and Frequency. And this deals with looking at your menu to make sure that the menu offerings you have will attract people, new guests, which is reach, as well as bring them back, which is frequency. We find many times that restaurants have menus that are too large for their kitchens because of brand creep, or menu creep and brand envy. And one of the things we try and do is get you to an optimal menu as well. The field studies that we do is when we have feet on the ground, looking at time and motion in the restaurants. We'll use drop cams to sort of monitor activities. We have people that will look at those cameras and do some timing studies. We're also observing things in the restaurants, and Anna later on will give you some explanation of how we do that. For those of you who have limited service restaurants, waiting in line is queuing, and the big no-no there is line rejection. Essentially, when you have guests who walk to your restaurant, or if you're in a business environment where you have a cafeteria and people see the line so long, they turn around and walk away. The bottleneck, this is what everyone knows about. Where are the choke points? Things that slow down a process. And what we'll talk about today is how to identify bottlenecks, but more importantly, recognize that sometimes when you improve a bottleneck in one area, you create a bottleneck in another area. We want to give you a holistic answer to that. The next topic is cockpit. We refer to this primarily in the kitchen on the line, but it could also be the cashier station, or it can be the service station for servers. And this is a small space that's usually in a small area where you're trying to get a lot of activity taken care of. Ideal sales per hour has to do with optimal performance, and this is one of the mathematical measures we'll talk about. And then capacity, what's the largest amount that can be produced? And one of the things you'll find out is that there's ways of determining how you can increase the capacity of your business, which in fact translates to greater sales. Desired behavior, as it revolves around your employees, has to do with the standard expectations you set for them. And when you create awareness of this overall system, you'll see that that awareness will translate into better performance for the employees because they understand the intention of what you're doing. The guest journey is what we call the pathway of the guest experience. What is the emotional and physical outcome that people have in an experience? And we define experience by emotion with activity, and we want to make sure that guests leave with a desire to return. And we want to make, all of us want to have a great guest experience. We're trying to walk you through how we achieve that. Systemic has to do with looking at the entire system in terms of how it works with each other, and then the holistic is the complete system rather than the individual parts, and that's what we're trying to do. And by the way, just as you know, if any of you have questions on the webinar, go ahead and enter them into the dashboard you have, and either throughout the webinar or as we moderate that, we will be happy to answer those questions for you. So as we get into the restaurant observations, now we're going to get to the nitty-gritty with feet on the ground. So I'm going to turn it over to Anna to go ahead and begin to present this piece.
Great, thank you, Fred. The process is one of the most exciting, food overall is one of the more exciting things that I like to spend my time on. And the reason for that is it is tying that science to the art of the business. So often as operators, we feel like we can feel the business. We know if things are going well or we know if they're not going well. And what we do when it comes to throughput is really looking at the busiest days of the week and the busiest hours within those days. So oftentimes when we're trying to build sales, you know, folks are looking at, okay, how do we build Monday night? Should we run a Taco Tuesday or this? What we do here with throughput is saying, okay, we're going to take our very busiest times and we're going to build sales within that time frame and on the shoulder periods. And we do that by being more efficient. So how do you figure out where, oftentimes when restaurants are busy, they feel like they're as busy as they can be. Well, we have an hour wait, so of course we're busy. What we do with the guest journey, Fred talked about the emotional side of the guest journey and all those important touch points that happen. But what we also do is we start right when the guest walks in the door, or if they're called ahead, and we look at that experience in a very scientific way. We literally will take stopwatches, and we will time from the guest walks in the door where they're going throughout the entire experience. We look at what barriers are in their way, and we call it day in a life, right? What is the guest experiencing from the time that they walk in? What are the employees experiencing throughout that time? And we're tracking the walkaways or the detractors. So as we go into benchmarking, the benchmarking is an important part. Fred, that's on the next slide, is when we really look at the standard, right? And so when we start with a standard, we're going to ask you what should the guest experience be? How should they be in your restaurant? Is it a 45 minutes? Is it an hour? Is it an hour and a half? If you have a drive-through, is it 2 minutes and 45 seconds that the guest should order and be having their food and driving away? It's very important to understand what your standard is for your business. And if you don't have one today, you can work that out with your team and you break it down component by component. When should they be greeted? When should they receive a drink? When should they get their entree, etc., until the time that they leave. We go and we measure against that standard. So we take timings. We literally have a stopwatch, and we'll say the guest walks in the door. How long did it take for them to get greeted? And you follow that throughout the entire experience. Over time, statistically, you need to do this in your busiest periods of time. You need to do it over a series of days and a series of different hours, because it's important for you to really not just be taking a thin slice of time, but you want a broad stretch. The more often you're there, you'll become invisible to your staff, and so you'll really begin to see what happens. But it's very difficult for an operator to do, right? You want to jump in and fix it. You want to jump in and make a change right away. And if you begin to do that, you won't really see what's happening in the restaurant and be able to fix it long term, and that's what you're really trying to do. And so that's how we go ahead and start with the benchmarking and how we gather data. As we move towards and getting into that ideal experience, we compare the ideal experience to the actual experience, and that would be next slide. And
Anna, we have a question. Anna, we have a question from the audience.
Okay, great.
How do you know what an acceptable service time is, either in limited service or casual dining? How does someone understand that? You mentioned, 50 minutes, an hour and a half, an hour 20 minutes, or in a QSR it might be only 50 minutes. How do you figure that out?
You know what? I break it down with what is the menu that you're serving and what is your expectation. So, if you're going to say, okay, it's a minute to greet the guest, okay, start there. How long should it be till they get a drink? And go there. And then entree. So should it be 6 minutes at lunch based on your menu and based on your capacity and ability to put out a 6-minute ticket time? Or is it 10 minutes or is it 12 minutes? Okay, the guest is going to eat. That component of your meal is uncontrollable, right? Whether they want to sit and talk for 30 minutes or they want to get in and out in 5, that you don't have control over, but you do have control over how quickly you get them the food, how quickly you get them the check, and how quickly you turn the table for the next guest. Same thing happens for a drive-through. You kind of do the same math. Okay, when the second they order, you know, how quickly can we get their food processed together, cashed out, and out the door? And so that's how I go about setting standards. You want it to be attainable. You want it to fit your menu and fit what's possible, and then you're building towards that. So that was a great question.
Great, thank you.
So once you've identified that ideal and you've done these timing studies, what I like to call them, and you have the data. You know, I was asked the other day how much is watching 10 guests enough? No, you know, 30 to 50 at a minimum, 100 overall would be a really good data set. But you want to be able to compare that to your ideal. And when you look at the next piece of it, and you see, in this particular example, we have an ideal, and then we have the actual. So you can see the actual total table turn is an hour. But when you look for the gap, or you look for the deviation between the greet and the actual, they lost a minute. The drink was right on. They wanted a drink served in 5 minutes. They got the drink served in 5 minutes. Entree was off by 3 minutes. Check delivery was off by 3 minutes. But from the time the guest left until the table was reset, there was a 7-minute gap. So in this particular example, work on the area that you have the most impact, which is the 7 minutes from the time the guest leaves until the next guest gets back. Too often we say, let's get faster, and that becomes just, okay, people running around and not really knowing what to do. In this particular model, you say, you can get your whole team around this and say, look, we're going to fix this piece of our business. We are going to, from the time the guest stands up until the time that you, and they start walking, I want somebody at the table to clean it, I want it pre-buffed, I want it wiped down, and host team, I want you walking towards that table before that the table's completely clean and they're down, right? Can you do it in a minute? Can you do it in 3 minutes? What is that standard? Because saving that time is where you're going to make money. Because guess what? You multiply, and Mike's going to get into the math of it, but you start multiplying out those minutes by the number of tables you have, and you can significantly reduce your weight, build confidence, and be able to drive you know, more business into your restaurant. So in this example, as you work through item by item and start making the improvements in the restaurant, on the busiest days of the week, which is typically 2 to 3 days a week, right, and a total of maybe 9 hours. When you think about what a small percentage of your business drives the majority of your sales, fixing that part of your business is critical. Making sure you have the right managers working, you know. But in this example for the year, it's worth $90,000 a year just in those small moments to fix the timing. And that's why this is so important. So after that, you're looking at flow. Now this is just a snapshot of a worksheet that that I made up. I was watching a restaurant. I saw that there was a lot of confusion from the guests, and because of that confusion, I just that each color was a different guest in the traffic pattern. I wanted to see what the guests you can see are circling around an area and walking around. And so in some of the solutions there, we're looking at, okay, is there a signage issue? Is there a flow? It's not logical for the guest. And by reworking some of the queuing areas and the lines, we were able to reduce some of that confusion. Another example is when you look at crossover, say you have an issue with the kitchen. You have long ticket times, and that's where your gap happens to be, and you're 3, 5, 10 minutes off. You go back to the line. You start looking at, okay, what's happening back there? And you do the same thing. You do a day in a life, but this time, instead of the guest journey, it might be of a specific entree or of a ticket. You start with a ticket. The ticket comes in. Where's the food going? How's it getting fired? What stations? And then sometimes you're going to notice the demand issues. Then you start watching where's the crossover. So if you look at the two orange circles there, after watching the station for this area for time, you can see in the corner there's a lot of crossover. People walking back and forth. Again, the different colors are identifying the different bodies and what they're doing and what their typical traffic pattern is. And you want to remove that confusion. So do you move product from one side to another? There's a snapshot that we're going to look at here in the kitchen that will show you just a real quick explanation. If you look at the girl on the right, that you can see her profile, well, behind her are the plates for that salad station. So every time she makes a salad, which is her job, salad maker, is she has to turn around and reach down to grab a plate. Okay? Doesn't seem so bad, but those plates are right next to the fryer. Well, if you look at the person with their back to you, to the left of them is where the fries are stored. So every time you get French fries, you have to walk across beside her, grab the fries, and come back again. So there's an example of unnecessary crossover. And I asked the question, I said, well, why don't you keep the salad plates under the salad counter, which was 75% empty? And they said, oh, we just never thought of it, right? You're going to have things in your restaurant that have just always been there for one reason or another, and you just didn't see it. So you're going to, when you go back and you look at the restaurant, you look at it during volume, and you just stand and watch, you will see things that you never ever thought of. So ask those questions. And then the next piece is the cockpit. This is a real critical part, and whether you're looking at your salad station, like the waiters, waitresses, making a salad or getting a beverage, or a bartender, or you're looking at a cashier in a takeout situation, like a drive-through situation, that efficiency, or on the line. This example here is on the line, and you're watching. This is to make a burger, right? And so you can see the poor guy, this is one burger that person just made. Now the green is a second burger that's being made. And you look at all these steps going back and forth across the line to put out one burger. Now the solution here was simple. And when I spent some time with the chef and I spent some time with the leadership team, I was like, well, why don't we put the bread here and the cheese there, and you have under-counter refrigeration, right? And we just looked at their station. This took no money to fix, but now the person that's working the grill station can, and this is how you want to think of all of your stations, can reach up, can take not even a full step, but a step and lean to the right, a step and lean to the left, underneath their counter. They are no longer going behind them at all. So there's no conflict of somebody coming behind and crashing as they're walking down the line. And in this example, it's extreme. We're able to save 6 minutes a sandwich off of this because of switching from where somebody ordered to where they picked up to where the burgers were, which was, that's an extreme example. But by watching that kind of diagram, the way they go across the cockpit, you can really see where that motion where those gaps are and where the barriers are. So
Anna, what we're looking at in terms of the orange rectangles, that's the cockpit. That would be the ideal situation where the cook is working within a very confined area, no crossover to another station, everything is within quick access, which allows them to be much more efficient in their work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you would have multiple cockpits, whether it's a fry station, a grill station, a broil station, salad station, any of those items.
And this is very important as you're growing your menu. A lot of the times when menus are being created by creative culinary chefs, they may not be looking at the operational implications. And when you start having menu creep, this is one of the areas we find really slows things down and involves it all over the place. So Anna has described a little bit of some of the physical activities where we do the time and motion studies. Again, we do it with cameras. Sometimes we patch into the restaurant's cameras that they may have if they have security cameras. A lot of it's just by standing there watching and observing these things. And what Mike's going to do now is get into some of the explanation of how we do the analytics through your POS data as well as the capture time studies that we've done.
Hey, thanks, Fred. Thanks, Anna. So I'm gonna talk kind of surface level, in terms of how the analytics go, but just to give you an idea as to what sort of the process is. The first thing that I would say is that when you start thinking about the bottlenecks and what you're really, what you're producing, how much of it you're producing, and how much demand there is, it really is a factor of supply and demand, right? Do you have your resources aligned with what your customers actually want to purchase? I think what makes this approach pretty unique is that it combines analyses of the actual point of sale. So we're taking what people are actually buying out of the point of sale, including when tickets are opened and closed and settled and so on and so forth. The turf analysis that Fred described, which is really understanding product by product and category by category. What sort of purchase intent do you have across the menu? This helps you understand not just what you're serving, which is what the point of sale will tell us, but actually what the potential demand is that expands your reach, your frequency. Are you actually aligned in terms of what the customers want, what your customers want, in terms of how you're producing the food and what you're offering, and then the field studies, which, as Fred described, includes feet on the ground timing studies, motion studies like Anna was describing, as well as some video pickup as well. So it's an interesting approach. It really gives a holistic understanding as to where the opportunities lie. Next.
Mike, we have a question. What is demand? How do you determine demand? Can you explain that, please?
Sure. So the demand is actually what I would say there's the constrained demand and the unconstrained demand, right? So the demand for your product can be measured by what you've actually sold, right? So meaning that you've got a restaurant and you've got a history of purchases, and so that is one of the truest the truest representations of what the demand is for your product and for different categories on your menu. What that can't capture is what people actually want that you're not serving, and that's why we go outside of the restaurant and we do consumer studies to understand what they would actually prefer, your customers as well as the competitive set, to understand what sorts of products they would rank as high purchase interest.
Thank you very much. I'll move on.
Sure. So I'm just going to, I know there's a lot of numbers on the screen, but I wanted to start with just a few ways of, you get a lot of information when you're running restaurants, and there's some simple ways to look at it. And if you don't look at the few data points, I mean, you could spend your whole lifetime looking at individual data points, but if you can identify where you get the most leverage in terms of looking at less data points, fewer data points to get more benefit, and changing some of your metrics, then it can be really beneficial. The call out here is, so you should start by just knowing what your peak hours are, right? So look hour by hour, or even in 15-minute increments is actually better. But understanding what the demand points are, or what the high peak hours are. And then look at it not just in terms of the high. So in this case, we're looking in the first set of tables. We're looking at the prior year, same period, and then the current year. As we go across, we're looking at the average number of transactions per hour. So that's a representation of just basically head count. And then in the last group, we're looking at revenue per employee hour. This is an important metric, I think, in understanding what your efficiency is. The trouble is, if like so many metrics, if you get there the wrong way, you can actually impede your potential revenue. And this would be a good example of it. So if you look at in the prior period, during the peak hour, in this case the sales actually dropped. But if you go all the way to the right, your sales per employee hour actually increased. This is a symptom usually of people trying to save their labor dollars. So they actually increased their efficiency on one metric, but actually impeded their own potential revenue during a peak hour. It's a very common mistake that we see when people are really focused on the cost side of the equation, and then they end up cutting the floor during peak hours or closing a register or what have you. So it's really important to make sure that you're incentivizing the correct behavior so that you're not impeding your own demand. Next.
Mike, we've got a couple of comments. You lit up the boards here with a couple of things you said. The first one that I'll go to is the second question. Is you just said that sales went down per hour, but the revenue per employee went up per hour, which would make people happy because their labor costs went down. But the question has to do with, explain that again. You're saying that we could actually hurt ourselves by improving our labor? How does that show here on that one section?
Yeah, that's so. So one table isn't going to give you the final answer on it, but it's a quick diagnosis, right? So before I go into a store, I would look at this and I would say, okay, revenue per employee is up, but revenue is actually down, right? That means that there's fewer people, right? That's the only way that you get there. So did they cut those people at the wrong places, or do they have the wrong people? How did we get there, right? So the first place I would look is say, do we have enough people to actually achieve our peak potential during our peak hours?
Got it. The other question had to do with, you mentioned that if you could break things down in half-hour or quarter-hour increments. Can you just elaborate on why that's important?
Sure. And I think that there's the diagnosis and then there's the operational tactics, right? This kind of a chart is great to say, okay, well, what are the things that I need to zero in on? But if you really actually want to change the speed of service, you need to get much more granular, right? So when you get into quarter hours, then you can start looking and actually applying things, especially if you've got a KDS system, you've got the point of sale where you know what time tickets are being fired and so forth. Then you can actually track, course by course and so forth, what's going out and when. That makes it more manageable, not just diagnostic.
Great, thank you. We'll move on. So,
a throughput analysis works really in any kind of service, right? I think as Fred and Anna were saying, whether it's a drive-through, whether it's a cafeteria, whether it's full-service dining. This is an example of a high-volume, very small, limited service concept that we worked with that had sandwiches, salads, pretty standard fare. What we found was that that they were trying to be all things to all people in many ways. So when we talk about, say, the demand and how that meshes with say the resources, the space allocation, and so on and so forth, we wanted to put this into perspective so that we could understand more about how they could make some design changes to be able to make more out of that small space that they had. So what we did was, going across the graph in the first column, we took station by station to look at what sort of line frontage they allocated to each one of these: sandwiches, grill, saute, and then there was a big idle space that actually had at one point been another station, but it had just shut down, and then salads. Then we looked at the actual sales share, and we found that, for instance, at the very bottom, salads were only 16% of their line frontage, but yet they were 48% of their sales share. So then we look at the discrepancy between the two. So the biggest shortfall was in salads. Secondary was really in sandwiches, and there was an enormous idle space, and then some over allocation toward the grill. We also did an external survey to understand what their customers' preference was. So this was kind of interesting because it not only reinforced that the salad line was actually the biggest preference, that was really why people were coming to the concept, but in fact there was significantly higher purchase preference for the salads than even they were already selling. So even though sometimes it might have seemed counterintuitive to say, okay, well, you're selling a lot of salads, but you're not as many salads as you could, right? So in fact, when we made some recommendations, and these were not expensive overhauls, it was really just about space reallocation. We allocated more, so we ended up having 45% of the line allocated to salads, and in fact 55% of the sales ended up being from the salad line. So sometimes it's just about making sure that you get the better reconfiguration. This actually allowed them to improve their total sales by 17% just by doing a reallocation to match really the demand with the supply in the peak hour. Next.
So Mike, this is basically talking about capacity, right? So this study allowed us to determine the increased capacity, and therefore by moving things around grew sales without any capital investment other than just the cost of moving equipment around.
That's right. Yes.
Great.
All right. So next slide. So here's the bubble graph might not seem as all that intuitive, but the message that I want to deliver here is that there's a difference between say the length of a queue, right, the line, meaning how many people are standing in the line, and the duration of that line. How long do you stand on it, right? And if you understand what those different factors are, then it will help you to not only understand what the current bottleneck is, but also what the next bottleneck is that's coming down the pike, right? So in this case, in that same example, we knew that the longest queue that they had was the salad line, followed by the sandwich line, but the salads were also one of the longest throughput items. They could not execute the salads as quickly as they needed to. The secondary bottleneck here is actually the cashier station, because they didn't have enough checkout points to be able to in the peak hour to be able to have a reasonable queue time. So when we did the analysis, what we knew was that once we eliminate this big bottleneck, which is the cold salads, if they don't add another register and some other forms of payment, then they're not actually changing the total experience duration. They're actually just going to move people to the cashier station where they'll wait on another line. So it was really important to make sure that if we were actually going to be able to break not just the first bottleneck, but the second bottleneck, and make sure that that's alleviated, and thus opening up additional capacity, that they were thinking two steps ahead.
Yeah, of course we see this in casual dining where you have bottlenecks at the registers for the servers that they're trying to check out guests that want to leave, which gets very frustrating in casual dining because you might have had a great meal and all of a sudden it takes 20 minutes to get your check and pay, which is again an example of a bottleneck in ways that we probably hadn't considered. And this example here has to do more with limited service restaurants, and as we get into this next table that Mike will explain, we're also looking at the duration of people sitting at tables as another measure to see how well that throughput's going for your overall guest experience. So go ahead, Mike.
Yes, so this is actually a pretty simple exercise to go through that I would really encourage everybody to do. Really, it's just looking at the seat utilization rate and the table utilization rate. So what does that mean, and what's the difference, right? So by hour, so if you've got 10 stores in your restaurant and they're all 4 tops, but 100% of your customers are 2 tops, then the highest seat utilization you're ever going to have is going to be 50%, right? So the table utilization rate would be 100%, right? But if you're only half seating each table, then you'd be at 50%. So this gap between the table utilization and the seat utilization is really a really beneficial starting point. So again, going to some of those peak hours where we look at, say, the noon hour where they've got 37% seat utilization rate and almost 80% table utilization rate, I know before I even take a step inside of this restaurant that they need to change up what the table configuration is and probably get more focused on just how they seat people, how they take reservations, and so on and so forth. So there's a significant opportunity just by more efficiently utilizing the space that you already have. Next slide, Fred. So what do I mean by significant? So in this example, we're looking at an AUV of about $2.5 million. So if you took your seat utilization rate, right, and you were able to improve that by 10%, right, meaning so if you've got a 100% table utilization with only 50% seat utilization, if you can improve that in this example by 10%, while simultaneously decreasing the dining duration by 6%, or excuse me, by 6 minutes, then that would represent about a $256 improvement in your peak hours. If we look at 8 peak hours per week and 52 weeks per year, then you get about a 4.3% increase, or $106,000 sales increase, just by focusing on that peak hour and driving more demand through when people actually want to eat. So this is just one example, I think, and I think any restaurant could set up a matrix like this so that you understand what's achievable, right? What's realistic, as Anna went through operationally, but then to really be able to quantify it so that okay, well, what kind of an investment is worthwhile in making sure that we can utilize our seats better, right, or improve our service standard times.
So this is where we don't want deuces at 4 tops. Because while your table is being utilized, your seats aren't being utilized. Those 2 empty seats are costing you money.
That's correct.
Okay, so basically, let's look at some of the results we're talking about. Here's a QSR result where, before we did our study, they were averaging a 5-minute drive-through time, or $1,700 per hour. And as a system, in this case, a small group of restaurants, $89,000 a week in sales, and then $2,500 per hour. And you can see the difference of what transpired here. All of a sudden, we cut the drive time in half through some of the methods that Anna talked about earlier, the analysis that Mike did, and sales have gone up by, significant amount, $800 an hour, with a big increase in sales and a big increase in sales per hour, and clearly then better guest satisfaction and lower labor costs. In casual dining restaurant example, this was a 44-unit casual dining chain that we did some of this application of work for. And over a 3-year trend, we had on the same store sales, 6.5% increase, 9.5%, and 13.5% increase with the same base number of units. Average sales went from $89,000 to $109,000 a week, and we can see that the average sales per hour went up very, very well in some of the different volume stores. The most important thing, of course, is almost a 30% increase in operating profit. And the last example is 65-unit casual dining chain, 11.3% sales growth, with a 202% improvement in cash flow. And so these are the kind of results you get. And keep in mind that we've done nothing. We've done nothing to change marketing. We've not spent any additional dollars outside. Very little capital improvement. We're just working within the confines of what already exists within your restaurant, but looking at your restaurant from a different set of eyes. So the things to consider, just to sort of recap part of this, is the design and layout of your restaurants, understanding what guests want and demand, in terms of the turf analysis, which is about getting new guests, which is reach, and getting guests to come back, which is frequency. The guest experience and the flow of that experience from a timing standpoint, we know that there's another level to the guest experience that has to do with the hospitality of your servers or your cashiers. But here we're talking about strictly the speed to get through the system. Looking at your staffing levels, in many cases, we're actually adding people at peak times to generate more sales per hour. You're adding total labor dollars, but your labor percentage will drop. That's an important thing to understand. The way we say it is when you have peak days or peak hours, you're playing offense. When you're in slower days, you're playing defense. Your kitchen operations and efficiencies, as Anna noted, through observation and really studying your line setup, looking at demand by station. If you take your menu mix and sort of do a matrix against what stations are being impacted, understand how that affects your operation. And then, of course, your actual production and assembly times after the order is placed. And all this does result in financial impact. And essentially, to recap it once again, you're increasing sales, you're lowering costs, you're improving productivity, but most importantly, you're increasing and enhancing the guest experience and making them want to come back. And this is the benefit of having a properly engineered and analytics approach to throughput in your restaurant. So we'll leave that open to any questions anyone may have while we have a few minutes left in our webinar, and we really appreciate your attendance and attention today. So we'll see if anything comes through, and if we don't get any, we'll sign off, and hopefully you'll join us for our next series of our webinars that we're putting in place. So I do have a question that came through. Anna, you know, how complicated is this? Is this something that someone can do themselves? Does it require an outside third party? How long does it take? Just give us a quick summary of that.
It's not hard to do. It is time consuming, and it's very detail oriented in order to, like I said, you really have to separate yourself out of the business and dedicate serious time to review your business. You have to have the discipline to not try to change things immediately. You want to do it in the very short term, and you want to spend that time to invest in, you know, if you fix it for the 100 guests that are coming through your restaurant at any given time, you're not going to be able to fix it for the thousands coming forward. And so I think it's a discipline and a fresh set of eyes that's important in order to look at the business in that way. The analytical piece, you're using both sides of the brain, and that's really where the analytical part is as important as the in-restaurant observation, and putting those two together tell the real story.
Okay, well, Mike, this dovetails into a follow-up question for you. Where did you get your numbers? Where do they come from? Is it all from the POS system, or is there other sources for some of this information?
Yeah, it depends a lot on who the client is, you know, who we're working with, and what they have. You know, so we've done the same type of study where there is no point of sale data available, so it's all feet on the ground with stopwatches. We've had some others where we've got some security cameras that we could use, and we can use the footage to actually you know, see what's being purchased and when. Ideally, it would start with the point of sale, as well as any kind of you know, in-store study or video, because then it's a lot easier to do on an ongoing basis. You know, in most cases, the point of sale is going to help you get this done reasonably efficiently.
Okay, so the POS system as well as the result of the time studies. So that's good. And we had another question: is when you introduce a change in your system or flow, how long should we get to see results? In our experience, once the study is complete, and to Anna's point, trying to avoid making changes on the fly, is when you do the reallocation of space or changing the cockpit for the cook, changing the way server stations are working, or even cashiers, how that flow is, the change is immediate. It's about a systemic change that will have impact right away. As an example, we worked with a QSR chain that had that real throughput problem in terms of speed of service for the drive-through, and by making these critical changes, their sales went from being down 5% to being up 8% in about 5 months. It's a very significant and dramatic change.
We have another question here, Fred, that are there any emerging technologies that can help an operator measure and track the staff's movements around the restaurant, front and back, during peak hours? And that's a great question, and something that Mike and I and our technology team have been looking at for the past year, of really trying to go deep and being able to gather that information. And we haven't found, well, I'll let Mike talk to it a little bit, but we haven't found something that's just right yet, I would say.
Well, let me make a comment. I think there's one thing that I do want to say, that if you have a KDS system, it does allow us to be able to track the time a ticket is completed, which then Mike can use in his analysis, which is helpful. If you don't have a KDS system, then when that food's completed is sort of an unknown. But go ahead, Mike.
I think the most replicatable ones that we've had where there is some form of video in store, that we can even just look at, even by indexing, even a manual process that looks at peak hours to understand, you know, what the traffic flow is, where the bottlenecks are, and so forth. So yeah, there's there's a lot of different ways that it can be achieved.
Well, also for QSRs, obviously there's a lot of systems that track the speed of cars going through your outdoor driveway. So those are systems that exist and are they're easily replicated. Fast casual restaurants may lack it. As I mentioned, having that KDS system has been the way that makes it let's put it this way, it gives you a permanent way of measuring this without having someone come in and do time studies. But these dashboards that Mike represented can be created, and you can sort of use them as a benchmark to just do frequent studies to see how you're doing. And you'll see it also in terms of your table turns. The technology may not exist in your system to help you manage throughput, but you can see the outcome of throughput or the result of throughput by measuring table turns in your operations, how long checks are open in a casual dining restaurant, for example. All right, it appears that we don't have any more questions. So once again, I want to thank you all for attending. We will get a copy of this up on our website, and we invite you to join us for our next webinar when we send it out to you. And we appreciate your time and attention. And hopefully we've helped you learn how to grow sales without a big bunch of capital improvement. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.